If magic can't be used, how can one like Matthew with his absolute physical attacks survive in a world that reveres magic? The protagonist, Will, has a simple goal: to defeat all the monsters in the dungeon labyrinths. Will is a 6th-year student at the Magic Academy. One day, during class, he was suddenly asked by his teacher, Edward, to demonstrate a practical exercise. The mention of a practical exercise gave Will a headache. Some classmates whispered and laughed. Edward urged Will to perform, but Will couldn't summon fire. This prompted laughter from the students, which Edward silenced. He mocked Will for not knowing basic magic despite being a student at their school, calling him a mere bookworm who only excels in written tests. Classmate Zion mocked Will by producing a flame, ostensibly to help. Edward didn't object, but used the opportunity to lecture everyone on the supremacy of magic in their world, declaring that magic is authority and power, and that magicians are heroes. He said those who have knowledge but can't use magic are useless and don't belong in their magic academy, even suggesting that Will should leave, likening Edward's unpredictability to Snape from the stories. "You dare defy the protagonist. Your comeuppance is due in a few days." Will managed to stay until his 6th year, mostly by earning credits in the dungeons, which Zion mocked. At that moment, a female classmate, Colette, stood up for him. Colette is a true top student, excelling in both academics and practical work. Yet, she showed no interest in Zion, and considered the less capable Edward a friend, even thinking of him as kind and gentle. She didn't allow Zion to insult Edward freely. Zion scoffed, questioning what use gentleness had in a world dominated by magic, let alone aspiring to be one of the Supreme 5 staffs, and told Will to leave the academy promptly. Colette comforted Will, saying Teacher Edward was too harsh. How could he say such things about Will? Will felt resigned, acknowledging that Edward's words were indeed true, and having Colette, a talented and beautiful girl, speak up for him was lucky. Colette blushed and teased that Will was sometimes too smooth-talking. Will replied that he was taught from a young age to compliment girls, and he wasn't lying. Colette really was outstanding. Will gazed at the distant white pillars, remarking on the beauty of the day. These were the Supreme 5 staffs, supporting the sky with their magic. Long ago, people didn't understand the sky and lived under constant threat from celestial invaders. Then, 5 supreme magicians appeared, drove the invaders out, sealed the sky, and brought light to the people. The legendary title of the Supreme 5 staffs became a coveted honor among magicians. Colette looked up, wondering if the ice staff was watching them from above. Will insisted it definitely was. Will remembered his childhood friend Elphalia telling him about the real sky, with its sun and moon, and how beautiful the sunset was. Elphalia had said that if they could reach the tower where the Supreme 5 staffs were, they might see a beautiful dusk. Will and Elphalia made a pact to witness the sunset together. It was just a childhood promise, but Elphalia truly had a great gift and became the youngest member of the Supreme 5 staffs, now at the top of the tower. Will, feeling far less capable, could not abandon their promise and continued to strive towards it. Soon after, another teacher, Vaakuna, scolded Will. Vaakuna thought it was too dangerous for Will to keep running to the dungeons, but still softened and gave him credits. He asked if Will was still not giving up on his dream. To become one of the Supreme 5 staffs, Vaakuna explained, one must first rise to the House of Lords, requiring numerous credits in academics, techniques, and practical skills. Will, unable to perform magic, could not score in techniques. Despite his efforts in gaining credits through dungeon combat, he couldn't climb higher. Seeing Will's bitter face, Vaakuna couldn't bear to continue and advised him to set aside his Supreme 5 staff's ambition and focus on passing the upcoming graduation exams. Will needed 4 credits this week, but had only 2 days left. Will immediately opened his notebook. Vaakuna, talking to himself, mentioned a new monster in the dungeon that Will hadn't yet defeated. Excited, Will hugged Vaakuna, unaware that Zion was eavesdropping outside, planning to use this chance to expel Will from the academy. That night, Will went to the labyrinth with his familiar, Kiki, who disliked the monster because it had previously scorched him. Meanwhile, Zion arrived at the dungeon with 2 underlings, who thought the 6th level was too dangerous. However, Zion, Disliking doubts about his strength and despising magicless individuals like Will, who dared to speak of the Supreme Five Staffs, insisted on going deeper. Just steps in, one underling was punched into a wall, and the other screamed. The scream immediately attracted Will and Kiki, who rushed over, suspecting someone was being attacked on that level. Peering through a crevice, Will spotted a demonic creature emerging, an evil spirit sentinel, a high-credit monster worth 10 points. Will remembered this monster was supposed to be in a sealed part of the dungeon. How had it come to the 6th level? Meanwhile, Zion was frantically battling, but the gap between him and the monster was too wide. He was no match. Will's first instinct was to save him, but he hesitated, wondering if he really should save Zion, who had always mocked and bullied him. If he fled now, likely no one would know. But then Will heard Elphalia's voice in his memory. She had told him that he was gentler and braver than anyone, and had given him a pair of glasses. Will sighed, admitting to himself that he wasn't really gentle or brave. He just wanted to stand beside Elphalia. So, putting on the glasses, he dashed forward and blocked the attack just in time. Elsewhere, Edward found Vakuna and informed him that Zion had recklessly taken people to the dungeon and had gone down to the 6th level. They were about to send a familiar to search for them. Hearing it was the 6th level, Vakuna relaxed, activated a magic crystal ball, and told Edward there was no need to search. Will was on the 6th level. At that moment, Will was like a sword saint reincarnate, facing off against the evil spirit sentinel alone and even cutting off its fingers. Zion was stunned. Was this the same timid Will he knew? Edward, watching the crystal ball recording, was shocked as well. Vakuna described Will as a heretic. He had unusual strength not seen in ordinary magic scholars, the resilience of a dwarf, and the insight to read an enemy's moves with just one glance. Will dodged the evil spirit sentinel's slashing attack. Vakuna noted that although Will could not use magic, he was the only true warrior in this magical world, with a strike as powerful as thunder magic. Then, Will picked up a great sword, cleaved the evil spirit sentinel in two, and approached Zion through the smoke to check if he was injured. Zion, envious, bit his lip in frustration. Edward also struggled to accept the reality that someone who couldn't use magic could surpass those who could. Meanwhile, Will took the head of the evil spirit sentinel, securing 10 credits and no longer worrying about his final exams. 5 years ago, 10-year-old Will was found to be unable to use magic. Many speculated he was admitted to the school as bait to attract Elphalia. Now that Elphalia has become one of the Supreme Five Staffs, everyone expects Will to be expelled. Back then, teacher Vakuna wanted to keep Will at the school and took him to see the principal to plead for his enrollment. The principal handed Will a dagger and cast spells on him, discovering that Will could block all magical attacks. Ultimately, the principal agreed to keep Will enrolled. Will's sole goal at the academy was to join Elphalia in the Supreme Five Staffs. Will is still studying at the academy, aiming to join the Supreme Five Staffs. Besides being chosen young like Elphalia, another path is through academic advancement to the House of Lords, where recognition from this top institution is essential to becoming one of the Supreme Five Staffs. There are only 2 ways to advance to the House of Lords: invent new magic or earn over 7,200 credits at the magic school. Most students rely on accumulating credits, and those in this remedial classroom, including Will, are the ones who lack enough credits. Thus, they need intense tutoring from teacher Vakuna. Will has earned all the credits in other subjects, but, unable to use magic, he can't earn practical credits. Colette admires Vakuna for being kind enough to tutor failing students, unlike the usually strict teacher Edward, who never offers extra lessons. While walking down the corridor with Colette, they overheard Zion's henchmen boasting that Zion had single-handedly defeated the evil spirit sentinel and was likely to become one of the top 3 in their grade soon. However, Zion knew it wasn't him who had defeated the sentinel. Just then, Will passed by, and Zion, seeing him, charged up, furious that someone without magic could defeat the evil spirit sentinel, striking a blow to his pride. While here, teacher Edward is still asking the principal to expel Will. The principal notes that Will is already in the 6th grade and excels in all subjects except magic. He also has an unusual understanding of magic, making him a highly talented student. Even without magical ability, he has prospects in magic-related fields. Training wise individuals is also a goal of the Academy. However, Edward argues that Will's aim is not to become a sage, but to join the Supreme Five Staffs. Therefore, the principal has Edward personally test Will, knowing Edward is aware of Will's true strength. He lets Edward decide the test content, and Edward vows not to go easy on Will. This is a deliberate move by the principal to let Edward, who is very familiar with the Supreme Five Staffs, see Will's power. Will, unable to use magic, usually asks Colette to help open his locker where he keeps his weapons because his roommates cling to him once he returns to the dorm. Colette remembers Will having a good relationship with his roommates, but Will sees it as just ordinary. Later, Will and Colette study in the library. Will works hard daily to earn credits. At that moment, Edward comes and takes Will to the training room, offering him 5 credits if Will can pass his test by striking him once during the fight. Failure would mean expulsion. Meanwhile, the principal has called Vacuna to the office and shows him the ongoing battle between Will and Edward through water mirror magic. The principal respects Vacuna's desire to protect Will, but also respects Edward's skepticism. Thus, he does not allow Vacuna to intervene in the battle. Vacuna finds this unfair. Any other teacher testing Will would be fine, but Edward is the closest man to the Supreme Five Staffs. Even though he was ultimately defeated, he was once a climber who reached the pinnacle of the tower. His strength is not to be underestimated. Even with the simplest spell, Edward can create impressive displays. He views Will's reliance on physical attacks as barbaric and irrational. Edward believes that those who cannot use magic should leave the Magic Academy, and he consistently pushes Will to his limits in their duels. Will is no match for Edward, but he believes that with a sword in hand, he at least has a chance to fight back. Meanwhile, Colette, who saw Edward take Will away, has been worried about Will's safety, fearing that Edward might physically punish him. At that moment, Will's familiar, Kiki, injured, runs to Will's locker. Colette sees Kiki scratching at the door of the locker and realizes Will might be in danger, so she quickly unlocks it. Edward, standing over a severely injured Will, tells him that the Supreme Five Staffs represent the pinnacle for all magicians. He says that if Will can't surpass himself, he has no chance of reaching the top. Edward argues that a single magician can defeat 10,000 ordinary soldiers and urges Will to give up his dream of joining the Supreme Five Staffs. As he steps on Will's head, Will grabs his ankle, declaring his desire to reach the pinnacle not for any grand reason, but simply to stay with the person he likes and to keep his promise to Elphalia. Edward is taken aback, dismissing Will's reasons as trivial and showing no respect for magicians who strive for the ultimate in magic. It's as if Edward, who could have excelled in humanities, is forced to study sciences, feeling a sense of despair. Just then, Colette arrives with the sword. Armed with a sword, Will finally sounded the horn of retaliation. Despite trembling under Edward's overwhelming magical attacks, he did not want to lose. In the story Edward told, about a magician facing 10,000 soldiers, the leader of the dwarven soldiers, who had no magical power, did not surrender even after all his subordinates had fallen. Instead, he courageously charged forward to fight the magician. Thus, in Will's view, a sword could indeed battle a magic wand. Will cut through Edward's magic, and his sword stopped by Edward's face, leaving a scar on his cheek. Edward said nothing more, awarded Will 5 credits, and then left. After the battle, Will fainted. The principal, in his office, praised him, noting the boy's spirit was truly strong. When Elphalia left, Will had promised that he would reach the Supreme Five Staffs. They had planned to watch the sunset together. Elphalia had teared up, saying she would always wait for Will. That was also the last time Will cried out loud. Apart from magic, Will excelled in other subjects, often being labeled a nerd. His family wasn't well off, so he had to deliver newspapers to make ends meet. Although weak in magic, Will was a strong fighter. He saw a newspaper article stating that his childhood friend Elphalia had become the ice staff of the Supreme Five Staffs and had invented 12 new spells. The House of Lords had announced a commission issued by Elphalia. Excited by the news, Will rushed back to his dorm and asked his roommate Rosti to help prepare magical tools and gather materials from the 4th floor. Besides the chance to see Elphalia, he could also earn some extra money. Rosti fixed the magic tools and stuffed a loaf of bread into Will's mouth, urging him to be careful. The founder of magic once said that everything originated in the dungeons, making them a popular training ground for magicians. When Will reached the 4th level of the dungeon, he saw many students undertaking commissions, including Zion, who had always disliked him. Since being saved by Will, Zion had felt unresolved and was continuously leveling up. Will sensed Zion's hostile aura. With all the monsters in the area cleared, he ventured deeper into the dungeon and saw a girl being attacked by 3 creatures. Will, putting on his glasses, rushed to help before the girl with braided hair could react. She realized Will hadn't used any magic, but thanked him afterward. The girl introduced herself as Alice, a 4th-year student. In this world, creating new magic is the most important task for a magician. Being able to invent new spells not only leads to fame, but also potentially a place in history. It is also the fastest path to promotion. Therefore, Elphalia, who has independently created 12 types of magic, is considered a genius without precedent or parallel. Everyone is amazed by her incredible abilities. Now, she dominates the field of ice magic. Colette realized that the person Will has been pursuing is truly formidable. After being saved by Will, Alice learned that he is the infamous non-magical failure of campus legend. Having been rescued by Will, Alice naturally does not despise him for his lack of magical ability. She came to assist the Supreme 5 Staffs and become one of those who support the skies. The sky everyone sees in this world isn't real. It is a barrier erected by the Supreme 5 Staffs. It is said that if this barrier ever falls, the world would plunge into darkness. The Supreme 5 Staffs are the pillars holding up this barrier. Students respond to the call of the Supreme 5 Staffs to contribute to the barrier's strength. Alice mentioned she once saw Elphalia in a dire situation. It was Elphalia who heroically saved her, enabling her to escape danger, which is why Alice deeply admires Elphalia. Alice said she used perception magic to scan the area and detected no suspicious creatures. However, Will discovered traces of monsters through other means and warned of a large one ahead. Will remarked that magic isn't everything, especially in dungeons. Reliance solely on magical detection can be misguided. Practical experience is crucial for understanding the unknown. At that moment, Will hugged the dazed Alice as a giant ice monster dropped from the sky. Alice remembered that this monster was tough to beat, the boss of the 4th level. Surprisingly, Will easily dodged its attack and even decided to fight it alone. Alice knew this boss strongly resisted physical damage, and close combat would result in instant freezing. However, Will was unfazed, claiming he had fought this type of boss several times before. Will embedded magical tools prepared by his roommate Rusty on his hands and swiftly moved forward, dodging the boss's attacks. Alice retreated and observed the fight closely. Will quickly moved behind the boss, wrapped the magical device around it, and tightened the ropes, leaving marks on the boss. Before the boss could freeze him, Will activated the device. The exploding flames shattered the boss into pieces. Will commented on the usefulness of Rusty's magical tools, praising their effectiveness. Alice's expression changed dramatically behind him. She was already thinking about how to report Will's actions. Will approached, carrying the materials, and announced that they had collected everything needed and could return. Indeed, Alice's role was not simple. She highly rated Will's performance on the battlefield, considering him a talented fighter despite his lack of magical ability. Therefore, she reported about Will to 4 members of the Supreme 5 Staffs. The Supreme 5 Staffs were still in a meeting, aware of enemies outside the barrier. To gather forces for a counterattack before the barrier broke, each generation of the Supreme 5 Staffs trained exceptional talents, and as a member of the observation team, Alice had the authority to recommend candidates. This time, she recommended Will. Though he lacked magical talent, his combat skills were notable. However, 2 members of the Supreme 5 Staffs immediately objected. Thunderstaff believed that utility was what mattered, regardless of race, while Elf Staff from the Elven race looked down on those without magic as an inferior race. Fire Emperor's staff was indifferent, but also held no fondness for non-magical individuals. Alice's interest in Will was also influenced by a recommendation from Elphalia. To enter the House of Lords, one must score at least 7,200 credits, and admission is a prerequisite to becoming a member of the Supreme 5 Staffs. The school conducts regular magic assessments where students battle stone statues using magic. Will, lacking magical abilities, attempted to use physical attacks, but became the subject of mockery from onlookers and was quickly defeated by a statue. Zion's followers taunted him, calling him the weakest at the academy for failing to defeat even a statue. In contrast, 3 students excelled: Ignore, an elven wind magic prodigy; Liana, a human thunder magic talent; and Jurius, another human with ice magic prowess. Recognized as top talents at the Magic Academy, they viewed each other as rivals. Jurius openly declared competition against Ignore and Liana, boasting of mastering a new secret technique and aiming to surpass them at the upcoming festival. They were all part of a group likely to secure positions in the House of Lords, each with scores over 10,000. Meanwhile, Will, in his final year at the Magic Academy, had only managed to accumulate 5,000 credits. Jurius disdainfully glanced at Will as he passed by, while his followers praised Jurius's prospects at the festival, confident that he would catch the attention of the higher-ups. Elsewhere, Colette approached Will and urged him to participate in the festival. Given his insufficient credits, performing exceptionally at the festival could be his best chance to ascend to the House of Lords. There had been precedents where students with insufficient credits were recruited by senior officials based on their festival performances. The festival referred to is the Grand Magic Tournament, held biennially by the Magic Academy, primarily featuring magical competitions. Supreme Tower sends senior magicians to scout for talents during the event. Colette described the tournament as a battle among factions from the Supreme Tower, namely the Thunder Staff, Elf Staff, Fire Emperor's Staff, Ice Staff, and Light Scepter. Currently, the Light Scepter faction is not participating in the combat. However, the other 4 factions are leading their subordinates, and being scouted by a magician from any of these 4 factions can lead directly to joining the Supreme 5 staffs, although such cases are very rare. Will feels that someone without magic abilities should not be in the Grand Magic Tournament, so he plans to help with logistics this year. Colette thinks it's a pity that Will won't participate. In fact, Will competed in the tournament during his sophomore year. Since he could only use physical attacks and not magic, he was accused of cheating. That tournament was judged the worst in the last 50 editions, and Will, not wanting to draw attention, never participated in the tournament again. While chatting, the two went to the storage room. Colette discovered a secret passage in a locker, and her familiar Kiki removed its disguise. They walked into the basement together and found a gambling scene secretly organized by the students, who were betting on which genius would win the tournament this time. Unexpectedly, Zion was also there, unhappy with his ranking. When he saw Will and Colette, he quickly stuffed his list into his pocket. However, his followers revealed Zion's true thoughts, saying, "Our Zion doesn't care about the rankings." Colette commented that Zion does care after all. Zion insisted he didn't care, arguing that score differences were merely due to the order of exams. He claimed he would never lose to those 3 in magic, revealing that he had been practicing seriously since that day. Realizing he was explaining himself to Will, Zion left in a huff. Originally, the competition had nothing to do with Will. His current task was to work at a dwarf tavern after school to earn his living expenses. Unlike others of his race who disdained dwarves, Will considered dwarves as companions. Rosti also worked with Will. When the dwarven uncle heard Will was short of living expenses, he asked why Will didn't participate in the Grand Magic Tournament, which offers a prize for the winner. However, Will said the competition was irrelevant to him. Will was popular among the dwarves, who did not treat him as an outsider. When the restaurant quieted down, Rosti asked why Will didn't ask teacher Vakuna for a referral to other jobs since the dwarves paid less. If he sought the teacher's recommendation, Will could get a higher-paying job. But Will felt he had already troubled teacher Vakuna enough, and besides, he liked the dwarves for their hardy, unconventional nature and their exquisite craftsmanship. They also accepted him, someone without magic, so Will had great respect for the dwarves. Unexpectedly, troublemakers arrived at that moment. Jurius and his followers, finding other restaurants full, entered the dwarf restaurant. They immediately started disparaging the place as low class, but were surprised to find Will working there. Jurius mocked that the inept and barbarians indeed go together. The dwarven uncle, close to Will, was displeased. Jurius regarded dwarves as just barbaric immigrants, displaying his racial prejudice fully. The dwarves were treated this way because their original homeland was destroyed by celestial enemies, forcing them to flee to Will's world. Unlike elves, dwarves were objects of disdain. Engaging with magicians could jeopardize their status, all because they lacked magic. In a world where magic was revered, this was the harsh reality. Rosty's dishes were mocked by Jurius and his followers, who deemed them as belonging to an inferior race and demanded the dwarves leave the country. Will removed his apron and confronted Jurius, demanding an apology, stating that the dwarves' beans were grown through their own effort and sweat, not deserving ridicule. To Jurius, this was merely pity among those without magic. He despised dwarves and kicked the served dishes onto Will. When Jurius's follower stood up to lecture, Will quickly knocked him down, spilling wine on Jurius. Will argued their actions were barbaric, no nobler than the dwarves. Jurius felt insulted by Will and froze him, preparing to humiliate him severely. Meanwhile, Rosty readied his magic wand behind his back to intervene. Noticing Will's resolute gaze, Jurius decided to humiliate him in front of everyone, challenging Will to join the Grand Magic Tournament, thinking it would be more satisfying than merely defeating him in the tavern. Jurius also demanded Will leave the academy if he lost the competition. Will agreed to compete, but insisted that if he won, Jurius must apologize to the dwarves. The Grand Magic Tournament has begun, and apart from the basic competitions, many senior magicians have come to scout talents. Beyond the Supreme Tower, various powers have also entered. Alice, accompanying the principal, watched the competition and saw Liana win the flying championship. Then Alice disguised herself to cheer for Will. Meanwhile, Zion fondly recalled the day Colette invited him to join the team, excited that Colette had finally realized that he was more reliable than the useless Will. However, upon arriving in the locker room, Zion was surprised to find Will getting ready, learning that Will and Colette were teammates. The reason for inviting Zion was simple. The team needed a total of over 21,000 academic points to qualify, and Will's scores were insufficient, so high-scoring Zion was needed to make up the numbers. Will apologized for involving Zion, but before Zion could react, Jurius passed by. Zion noticed that Will's focus wasn't on him, but on Jurius behind him. Colette mentioned that Will and Jurius had a dispute and had agreed to confront each other in the tournament, which is why Zion was brought in. Hearing this, Zion felt even more undermined, recalling the humiliation of being saved by Will in the dungeon and now being seemingly overlooked. One of the commentators for the tournament is Teacher Edward. Before the team competition, a group of elves skilled in magic will set up defense arrays in the venue and simulate the battle environment. Centered around the arena, the venue expands into scenes of different areas. Teams of 3 will compete across these areas to reach the arena. Winning the crown inside the arena constitutes victory. During this, competitors will not only face obstacles from the different areas, but also many stone traps set around the venue. Described as a battle royale in the magic competition, according to the host, Ignore and Jurius are the most popular contestants. The host has bet all his assets on Ignore. Besides these 2 favored competitors, Will's team, known for his supposed lack of skills, also attracted attention, though mostly through mocking jeers. Concerned that Will would be targeted, Teacher Vacuna was apprehensive, but Will insisted on winning this match no matter what, leaving Vacuna no choice but to let him compete. The competition had already started, and Jurius's team first encountered a matrix of stone statues. Unexpectedly, Will was the first to charge forward. Spectators outside the arena ridiculed him, doubting his ability to even touch a statue, let alone defeat one. However, at that moment, Colette had enchanted Will with stone gauntlets. With a single punch, Will sent a statue flying, causing a scene of dramatic destruction, leaving the previously mocking spectators speechless and stunned. Vacuna sighed, knowing things would turn out this way. Colette argued that using magic gauntlets in combat is, in a way, also magic, so it wouldn't count as cheating. Thus, Will's team was the first to break through the challenge. Meanwhile, Zion was deeply unsettled, unable to forgive himself for needing Will's rescue in the dungeon. Now, the team had entered a desert area where Will charged through aggressively. Whenever he needed a weapon, he would call out to Colette, who conjured magical weapons for him. Will advanced, hurling magic swords that struck directly at the cores of traps, relentlessly making his way through the desert area. The audience was baffled. How could the underdog be so strong? Some skeptics believed it was only because Colette's magic was too powerful. Indeed, Colette's magic deserved praise. But those who understood a bit about the situation knew that without Will's abilities, it would be impossible to utilize Colette's magic to such an extent. Even Edward had to grudgingly admit Will had practical experience. Will's team was nearing the finish line, while Jurius's team was also performing well. Jurius's underlings discovered Will's team ahead of them, but Jurius was unfazed, confident in his strategy. Next, Will's team entered a forest with magic set up by Edward, but unexpectedly, Will chopped down the magical formations on the ground, causing the dark magic to counteract and neutralize each other. Edward clicked his tongue as he watched. Will knew the forest would be a convergence point for all teams. He planned to ambush Jurius's position in advance, but surprisingly, Jurius's team arrived there first. Immediately, Jurius launched a massive ice attack at Will. Before Will could counterattack, flames erupted behind him. Zion suddenly attacked Will from behind. Fortunately, Colette reacted quickly and erected an earthen barrier behind Will to block the flames. Will was still confused. Why would a teammate attack him? But the forest around them had been leveled, and Jurius had disappeared. Zion complained that Jurius was an annoyance and felt used by Will and Colette. Unable to hold back, he challenged Will to a duel right there, expressing his long-standing resentment. Colette tried to intervene, but an ice wall set up by Jurius blocked her. Will stated it wasn't the time to fight Zion, but Zion insisted on a confrontation. Initially, Zion didn't dislike Will. He even felt Will was quite pitiable. As everyone scorned Will for his lack of magic skills, Zion was the first to step up and burn the label behind Will. However, Zion didn't want to be friends. He wanted Will as his underling to avoid further disdain. He intended to look out for Will, but Will ignored him. At that time, Will seemed lifeless, never acknowledging them and only focusing on the tower where the Supreme Five Staffs were kept. Zion felt shattered being ignored for the first time, and since then, he grew to dislike Will. Now his discontent has built up and erupted in relentless attacks against Will, demanding a counterattack. But Will, believing they are teammates and competing for a dwarven elder, saw no reason to fight Zion. Others also failed to understand Zion's actions. Zion's attack on a teammate, despite his talent, was seen as foolish and likely cost him points with the talent scouts. Edward commented on Zion's foolishness, while seemingly pleased with Will taking hits. The scouts recognized Zion's potential, but deemed him too impulsive, still just a student. Rosti expressed regret, and Alice, who sat beside him, mentioned she was recommended Will by a prominent figure and was now completely smitten. Rosti, cradling his face, noted Zion's obsession with Will, joking that Will was a heartbreaker, even admitting his own fascination. No, wait, it's the smell of testosterone. Meanwhile, Jurius lured Colette into a trap, criticizing her for running away and not living up to the name Princess of Earth, a title she disliked. Yet she was hit by the trap. At this point, the audience of students realized something was wrong as Jurius appeared in front of all the competitors. Including fellow competitor Ignore, Jurius announced he brought a new secret technique. Then, Ignore returned the ice flower given to him by Jurius, instantly splitting Jurius. Ignore remarked that Jurius indeed mastered a great secret technique, likely one developed by the Supreme Five Staffs. By now, everyone believed Jurius and Ignore were the likely champions, feeling sorry for Will's team, which could have taken first place, if not for Zion's internal strife. Yet, Zion's followers seemed to understand his actions. Will, watching Zion, was reminded of his own past. After Elphalia joined the Supreme Five Staffs, Will stayed alone at the Magic Academy, ridiculed by other students despite doing nothing wrong. He just wanted to study peacefully and endure the bullying without seeking approval or making self-indulgent remarks. All he wanted was for people to leave him alone. Facing Zion, he always asked to be left alone, feeling he never had enough time and needed to find a way to reach Elphalia. At that moment, Zion summoned a Phoenix Guardian, a spell that demands great magical skill. Not only did Zion manage to summon the Guardian, but he also launched a different fire spell simultaneously while guarding against attacks on Will. Though Will blocked the attack, the audience erupted in excitement, including Teacher Edward, who was shocked at Zion's mastery over fire magic, surpassing many senior magicians. This was far beyond a student's level. The attending scouts revised their opinions, and even the faction from Fire Emperor's staff reported Zion's information directly to the Fire Emperor's staff itself. Will knew Zion had gotten much stronger but still saw no reason to fight him. Zion challenged Will, asking if he was serious, accusing him of playing dumb for so long. Didn't Will hate him? Will admitted he was very angry and had imagined beating Zion many times, but his main goal was to defeat Jurius, so he had no time to battle Zion. The more they talked, the angrier Zion got, upset that Will ignored him. Zion just wanted Will's attention. Realizing something was amiss, Will acknowledged his own desire for recognition, something he had never admitted before. Hearing Zion's words, he realized they shared the same thoughts. Thus, Will readied his weapon for a serious fight with Zion. At that moment, Zion summoned a guardian and launched a wide-ranging fire attack. Will, foreseeing the trajectory of the flames, skipped defense and directly struck the guardian's core. As they were about to clash, Colette intervened with a stone wall, wearing her tattered school uniform. She angrily announced she had beaten Jurius, who had then disappeared. Embarrassed, Zion covered his face, shocked that Colette was exposing her skin. Colette, annoyed, pointed out Zion was to blame but decided to let Will face Jurius, while she held off Zion. Will had already taken off his jacket and handed it to Colette, making her blush. Zion, realizing his loss, saw Will's gesture of covering Colette with his jacket and felt even more defeated. Colette mocked Zion for his comments about her being too exposed, noting how poorly he understood attraction. Will suggested they could fight another time, prompting Zion to become anxious. Just then, Jurius arrived at the arena. But before he could even remove his crown, Will charged at him. Elphalia's adjutant approached her with a recommendation for a talent from a magic academy discovered by a headhunter. Among them was Jurius, a genius highly valued by the Ice Staff faction. The headhunter suggested that Jurius's talent could make him a potential heir to Elphalia. After reviewing the information, Elphalia commented that if the records were accurate, Jurius indeed qualified. At the same time, Will was in the arena facing Jurius, who intended to humiliate him. However, upon hearing that Will aimed to make him apologize, Jurius crushed an ice flower, declaring his intent to ascend to power over Will. A mist of ice formed around them. Will figured there were 3 opponents to dodge, and by avoiding their attacks, he could pinpoint their location. Unexpectedly, after dodging 3 attacks, Will's blade was about to strike Jurius's head when another ice pillar intercepted from an angle. Jurius, along with 2 teammates, hadn't moved from their spot. The attackers were just Jurius's duplicates, and not just one but several that could even explode. Though Will was frozen in place, the arena fell silent with no cheers, as the crowd was in shock. Jurius had mastered one of the 12 secret spells of the Ice Staff, created by Elphalia herself, the spell to create duplicates of oneself. Will asked Jurius how he knew Elphalia's magic. Jurius, smugly, claimed it was due to his talent. Though he had only scratched the surface, it was enough to prove he could become one of the Supreme 5 Staffs. Jurius not only boasted about his achievement, but also belittled Elphalia. Provoking Will further, Jurius disrespected Elphalia in front of him, threatening to expose her true nature. Will broke free from the ice and confronted Jurius, who had already trapped him inside a barrier, and mocked him for losing his composure, likening him to a wild beast. Jurius then summoned a massive ice block to crush his opponent. Edward returned to his seat, remarking that this was the true example of a mage, unmoved and effortlessly defeating the enemy. Jurius thought he had dealt with Will and declared to the headhunters present that he could become Elphalia's heir. However, Alice saw through this display. It was all a show to promote himself, using Will as a stepping stone. Alice and Rusty both laughed, knowing that if Jurius did not actually defeat Will, it would be quite embarrassing. Sure enough, the ice block thought to have encased Will was split with a single strike. Jurius turned in shock, only to hear Will say, "Thanks to this ice, I've calmed down." Jurius attacked again, but by then, Will had teleported behind his 2 teammates. After knocking them out, Will remarked that Jurius's mastery of the magic was imperfect. Watching Will dodge attacks from below, Teacher Edward on the stage frowned, reminded of his own recent battle with Will. After his teammates fell, Jurius's duplicates suddenly collapsed. Will adjusted his glasses and stated that Jurius was only able to use Elphalia's magic by relying on his teammates. and he was still far from reaching Elphalia's level. This comment struck a nerve with Jurius. At that moment, Elphalia told her adjutant that she never wanted an heir, but rather a sword by her side. A disheartened Jurius summoned 4 duplicates. Just as Will had said, Jurius could not move more than 4 duplicates at once, turning them into stationary turrets. Even so, Jurius felt that Will could not distinguish the real him because his duplicates looked as handsome as he did. Faced with such narcissism, Will responded with reality, teleporting directly in front of Jurius and swiftly kicking him into submission. Jurius asked Will how he recognized his real body. Will explained that when using Elphalia's magic, the average body temperature of the caster drops by about 36 degrees, and it drops even lower when the magic is cast imperfectly, causing the cold to seep out and ice to form underfoot. Jurius questioned why Will, a non-magician, knew more about the magic than he did. Will revealed that he and Elphalia were childhood friends who grew up together in the same orphanage, making him very familiar with and admiring of her magic, which he had always studied seriously. However, he admitted he could never match Elphalia. Elphalia smiled, acknowledging Will's efforts and assuring him they were not in vain. Will also knew the weaknesses of her magic, which further unsettled Jurius. He exclaimed that Elphalia was among the Supreme 5 staffs and could not possibly have weaknesses. It was unclear whether Jurius admired or sought to belittle Elphalia, but Will's comment had thoroughly shaken his confidence. Jurius had been proud of mastering a spell that Elphalia had created at the age of 2, which was not perfect and had flaws. Realizing that his prized magic was merely a creation of a 2-year-old girl left Jurius devastated. He then summoned 8 duplicates, intending to overwhelm Will with numbers. Will sighed, mentioning he had grown up being teased by more than 10 of Elphalia's duplicates. As his duplicates were continuously defeated, Jurius had to abandon the elegance typical of a mage and started to physically fight Will, who easily defeated him and delivered a crushing punch that sent Jurius flying. Meanwhile, Rosti was stunned, while Colette and Zion arrived at the scene. Liana also remembered Will, and everyone thought Will was likely to be the champion. However, the situation turned unexpectedly when Ignore, always underestimated, took advantage of the distraction. After hearing Will's comments, Elphalia blushed with embarrassment and defensively claimed she used her duplicates not to bully Will, but because she was too fond of him and wanted him all to herself. Now, her embarrassing secret was known throughout the school. Zion, witnessing Will defeat Jurius, vowed to study magic diligently to defeat Will next time. Although he did not win the championship this time, Will was happy, feeling he had moved a step closer to Elphalia. To celebrate Will's victory over Jurius, the dwarves hosted a celebration banquet and invited Rosti, Colette, and teacher Vacuna. Unfortunately, Will wasn't recommended by headhunters, which Colette believed was due to a last-minute conflict caused by Zion, leading them to be unexpectedly defeated by Ignore. At the banquet, Will also invited Zion, who declined to attend. More importantly, Jurius kept his promise by apologizing after losing the match, and was even put to work in the dwarves' kitchen. The dwarven matron said that apologies must be paid for with actions, reflecting the dwarven way. Since they were short on staff, they enlisted Jurius and his group. Having failed in the competition and lacking headhunter interest, Jurius had no choice but to work earnestly there. Teacher Vacuna, however, was concerned about Will's future. Colette was still puzzled, and realized something was off when they returned to school. Everyone had seen Will's performance at the magic competition, and their opinions of him had changed, inviting him to join dungeon exploration teams. Colette stepped forward, criticizing their sudden change of attitude towards Will, suspecting he would be upset. However, turning around, she found Will delighted by the invitations, surprising her as she realized this was the reaction of someone not used to having friends. At that moment, a classmate accused Colette of having monopolized Will, while Colette hastily grabbed Will's shoulder, claiming they had already planned to go shopping together. She felt as if it was similar to a date and resolved to wear a pretty dress the next day. Meanwhile, Rosti asked Will if he was going to the dungeon the next day. Will replied that he planned to go shopping with Colette to buy equipment and weapons for their upcoming comprehensive training. Learning that Will and Colette were going out alone, Rosti looked somewhat uneasy. The next day, Colette dressed up nicely and appeared in the square, determined to turn the shopping trip into a date. Will arrived in a hurry and complimented Colette on her outfit, which made her blush. Unexpectedly, Rosti also showed up. Will scratched his head awkwardly, explaining that Rosti thought more people would make it livelier, so he insisted on joining them. In front of Colette, Rosti boldly held hands with Will, nearly shocking Colette to death. She looked up to see Rosti making faces at her, which she couldn't stand. She had hoped to get closer to Will, but found Rosti and Will getting along even better, which frustrated her. When Rosti went to buy something, Colette indirectly asked Will whether Rosti was really a boy, puzzled by their close relationship. Will assured her, patting his chest, that Rosti was definitely a boy. He had seen proof, jokingly adding that it was impressively so. Colette teased, suggesting their relationship seemed a bit too intimate. At that moment, Rosti brought over 2 drinks, handing one to Colette and the other to Will, mentioning he would just share with Will. Immediately, Colette pushed her drink towards Rosti, insisting he drink his own. Consequently, Rosti sent Will off to have his weapons repaired by the dwarves. With Will gone, Colette got straight to the point, asking Rosti if his actions toward Will were overly intimate. Rosti admitted right there that he liked Will, even claiming to love him more than Colette did. Colette, not to be outdone, mentioned she had been close with Will for 4 years, though she dismissed it as an embarrassing history. Rosti retorted, pointing out that they had never bathed together, whereas he and Will bathed together every night, intensifying the dramatic confrontation. Will also sensed something off between the two, but thought they just weren't familiar with each other yet. Just then, as he reached a small alley, he encountered Liana, one of the top 3 students in their grade. Liana, known for her perfect scores in academics and practical skills, approached Will to talk and pulled him into a private room. Inside, Ignore, Jurius, and Zion were present. Liana mentioned that the end of the 6th grade was approaching and discussed the comprehensive practical training. She wanted to invite Will to join their team for a dungeon expedition. Jurius and Zion, sitting on chairs, visibly tensed up. Will, sensing trouble, looked up at Liana, who seemed oblivious to the strained relations among the 3. Zion, feeling ignored by Will again, lunged to grab his collar, but was stopped by Ignore's illusion magic. Liana candidly expressed her belief that Will possessed unique abilities that could shine in the dungeon, and she wanted to form a strong team, which is why she specifically invited him. Jurius and Zion were displeased, with Jurius doubting Will's usefulness in the dungeon. Ignore intervened, pointing out that both had lost to Will and had no right to look down on him. He emphasized that even if Will didn't use magic, the fact that he defeated their magic with his sword was undeniable. Facts were everything. Ignore, who had lower academic credits than Liana, respected Colette's choice of teammates and differed from the 2 who failed and refused to admit it. Jurius and Zion clenched their teeth in frustration. Liana stated she needed to enter the Supreme Tower with top results to achieve better than her current performance. Will was confused, asking if someone with a thunder staff had already recruited Liana. However, Liana replied that those remaining at the academy were unsold inferiors. She explained that her family had a short lifespan and she needed to secure great military achievements in her limited life to prevent her family's decline. Merely reaching the Supreme Tower was not enough. Under necessary conditions, she aimed to become one of the Supreme 5 staffs. Liana said everyone present should share the same goals, so she suggested deciding by tossing a coin. Jurius and Zion were persuaded, and for higher academic credits, Will also chose to join Liana's team. Teacher Vakuna told them that after the start of the comprehensive practical training, levels 7 to 10 of the dungeon would be unlocked. This training was the only opportunity to earn over 1,000 credits in one go by defeating the bosses on each level and gaining a large number of credits to enter the House of Lords. However, there was also a high risk. Last year, 4 students were eaten by monsters. Despite teachers being stationed in the dungeon, dangers could still occur. Edward reminded students to have a clear understanding of their own abilities. Although Colette was not invited, she insisted on following Will and the others. Rosti, being a student of magical engineering, could not join them in the dungeon. There were designated shelters on each level where students could take refuge with a teacher if they could not win a fight. However, choosing to take refuge meant automatically ending the exam. Meanwhile, a team responsible for retrieving items from the dungeon had also entered, appearing quite formidable. The current acting manager of the Supreme 5 staffs, Carriot with the Fire Emperor's staff, received a message from their deputy that the Light Scepter was still on an expedition. However, the barrier was almost at its breaking point. Meanwhile, Will and his group officially entered the dungeon. As the teacher announced the start of the practical combat, Will's team immediately dashed out. Ignore cast a wind magic spell to speed everyone up. As soon as Will landed, they encountered a large swarm of ant monsters. Will positioned himself for combat, but unexpectedly, Liana charged forward first. It turned out that Liana's family were knights, and she herself was a rare close combat mage among magicians. Teacher Vakuna had once said that the most important thing in the dungeon was perception magic, to detect the enemy's position first. Now, teamed with Will, the others were so strong that they dealt with the monsters before Will could even detect them. Will felt he was hardly any help. Ignore alone could take out the enemies with a single strike, making Will question Liana's judgment. However, Liana mentioned that facing strong enemies would reveal their true capabilities, though she admitted she was somewhat unsure herself. After defeating monsters, a magician's magic power would linger on the remains, so they didn't need to collect these remnants to earn credits. Only Will did. Thus, instead of helping, it seemed he was more of a burden. After collecting many remnants along the way, Liana decided it was time to rest. Ignore set up illusion magic around them, creating a fire that kept nearby monsters at bay. Will touched the flames and realized they were just illusions, without actual heat. Liana asked Will to distribute the prepared food. Will intended to hand biscuits to Ignore, who, despite recognizing Liana's decision to include Will in the team, was quite haughty. He didn't want anyone he didn't approve of to approach him, claiming it was an elf's custom. In this team, he only recognized Liana. Will knew that both dwarves and elves were immigrants from other realms, but elves were a revered magical race, known for their strong sense of kinship and arrogance, yet their talents were remarkable. The elf staff of the Supreme Five Staffs was an elf, and also a princess of the elves. After eating and drinking, Liana outlined their next plan. Their main target was Nabez, worth 110 credits, also the boss of the 10th floor. Teams that had previously attempted to defeat Nabz had always suffered casualties. Liana aimed at Nabz to prove to the Supreme Tower their capability to conquer it. They needed to conserve magic and reach the 10th floor as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, an assassin on the 10th floor had already killed many people and monsters. When Will's team arrived, they saw numerous monster remains. Will inspected the bodies and found them devoid of magical energy, killed by brute force. Soon they reached Napes' location, only to find something amiss upon lighting a lantern. The 10th floor boss had been slaughtered. The team immediately cast perception magic. But Will knew dungeon perception magic wasn't infallible. Some monsters even had the ability to shield themselves from it. So, he closed his eyes to listen, and soon detected a monster right above them. Will blocked the first attack, but didn't expect a monster to appear next to Ignore, knocking him out with a slap. The rest of the team quickly prepared for defense, only to be surprised as the ground was smashed by the monster, causing everyone to fall into an abyss. Will, finding Ignore still unconscious, immediately rushed to protect him. Meanwhile, the teachers and students from other subjects on the upper levels also noticed something was wrong, as the noise from the collapse was too loud. Will protected Ignore as they fell to a deeper floor. He was concerned Ignore might resist being touched, but found Ignore unconscious with a severely injured arm. They likely fell to the 11th floor. Zion and Jurius also landed together, both aware that the 11th floor was only for high-level mages. Liana knew more. This was not just the 11th floor, but a structural part of the entire dungeon, connecting to the location of the 15th floor below. Being alone here meant certain death, so she and Colette needed to regroup with their team. During this time, Ignore had a nightmare. He dreamt his family called him incompetent, and his friends abandoned him, saying he couldn't control illusions, and even his arm was severed. He woke up in shock to see a dragon's head cut off. Still dazed, he instinctively pushed away Will's offered hand and claimed he could dress his own wounds. Given the elves' prideful attitude, Will had no choice as it was in their nature. He handed the medical kit to Ignore. While Ignore was bandaging himself, Will checked their equipment. Some were now unusable. He decided they needed to regroup immediately as they wouldn't last a day on the 11th floor. He asked Ignore if he could continue walking. Ignore mentioned that one should wait for rescue if in trouble in the dungeon, but Will believed staying inactive meant certain death. especially as the monster that knocked them down was still around, making quick rescue unlikely. As Will predicted, the Magic Academy's teachers also sensed something was wrong. The 2 teachers stationed in the dungeon had perished. The 8th floor was now in chaos, and the status of the 9th floor was unknown. Vacuna suspected a planned attack, but then heard Professor Edward announce the suspension of practical training as the students were in danger. It was time for them to act. Rosti stepped out of his tent, looking worriedly in the direction they had gone. At this time, the injured Ignore was like a startled bird, wanting to cast perception magic after taking only a few steps. Will advised him to conserve his energy, or he would exhaust himself. Will and Kiki could handle the surrounding detection and would notify Ignore when to use his perception magic. Their goal was to avoid large-scale battles, a strategy Will had developed from his own dungeon combat experience, being non-magical himself. Just then, they encountered a battle they couldn't avoid. Will deliberately shielded Ignore behind him and let him handle a monster approaching from behind. However, Ignore was too focused on Will, amazed at how calmly he could fight. This distraction allowed the monster to get close. Ignore intended to use a fire illusion to scare the monster away so he could use his magic from a distance. Seeing the danger, Will intervened, cutting down the monster, and explained to Ignore that the creature was blind, making illusion magic ineffective against it. Ignore chuckled bitterly, admitting he was embarrassed. He confessed he wasn't an exceptional elf. Within his community, and to Will, he was considered the least capable, just like Will. Ignore and Will are notably similar in one respect. Both have a talented childhood friend and are considered the least capable in their respective communities. Ignore says he's the only elf to have spent 6 years in the academy without leaving, while other elves have already ascended to the Supreme Tower. He is the disgrace of his race, known among his people as the weakest link. This label comes from his use of illusion magic, which isn't really illusion magic at all, but magic that turns illusions into reality. However, no matter what Ignore does, his illusions remain just that. As Liana says, they are merely surplus goods. Indeed, those truly gifted don't wait to graduate to enter the House of Lords, but create new magic early on and successfully ascend the tower. The Academy calls these 3 geniuses, but they are merely mediocrities close to genius. Moreover, having seen Elphalia, Liana deeply understands the gap between herself and the top geniuses. Ignore first realized he was just mediocre through his foster sister, who is also his childhood friend and the current elf staff, Princess Erno of the Elves. As a child, Ignore always felt he should protect his sister, even teaching her magic. Unexpectedly, when young Erno first cast magic, she created a massive tree, the king of the forest. Following this, Ignore was forced to separate from Erno, who went on to become one of the Supreme 5 staffs. Ignore has been striving to reach her side, but no matter what, he remains the weakest link in the elf race. He tries to scorn magic users, but it's merely self-deception. He thought revealing his feelings would make Will despise him, but instead, Will said they were alike. Ignore thought Will was just comforting him, but Will insisted he would protect Ignore, stating he saw Ignore as an exceptional elf. Colette also told Liana they shouldn't feel inferior because of their talents. Colette believed that even if Will heard these monologues, he would just laugh it off. On the 11th floor, Will's strength truly showed. The monsters were much stronger, but Will seemed at ease. Ignore was amazed by Will's stamina, but noticed Will was injured while protecting him. Ignore couldn't understand. His own kind had abandoned him, yet Will was fiercely protecting him. At that moment, Kiki alerted them to a monster, which Ignore's senses hadn't detected. Will explained it was a newly emerged creature from the dungeon, extremely powerful, immune to physical damage, and highly resistant to magic. A formidable foe even for Supreme Tower mages. The only effective magic against this monster was the elves' illusion magic. Will said he needed Ignore's help. Ignore broke down, claiming his illusion magic was incomplete and couldn't inflict real damage. Will reassured him that failure was okay. They were not geniuses and had to progress through failures. He wouldn't die easily because, like Ignore, he had someone he was striving to reach and wouldn't die before reaching them. At that moment, Will had already engaged in combat. Ignore realized they shared the same dream, which gave him the courage to attack with his wand. However, the magic still had no physical form, and Ignore feared he might endanger Will. Then Kiki deployed a barrier to block the attack. Will encouraged Ignore again, telling him not to give up and that he believed in him. Ignore thought of his kin who had abandoned him and, despite his sadness, didn't want to let Will down or give up on protecting Erno. He used his illusion magic again, and this time, he truly turned the illusion into reality. Will turned back, celebrating joyfully, only to find Ignore kneeling on one knee, apologizing for his earlier attitude towards Will, and acknowledging him as a friend recognized by the elves. Unknown to Ignore, Will had long noticed Ignore secretly practicing illusion magic every night, and respected his dedication. After defeating the formidable foe, Will followed the map Rosti gave him and Kiki's guidance to go find Zion and the others. Zion and Jurius, who normally don't get along, were hiding in a corner because Jurius was wondering how Zion had improved so quickly. Zion, having been previously tricked by the evil spirit sentinel, became extra cautious in the dungeon. When faced with the evil spirit sentinel that had embarrassed him in front of Will, Zion didn't hold back. He had Jurius summon duplicates while he directly set the monster on fire. Meanwhile, the students on the upper levels were also attacked by the evil spirit sentinel, including 2 of Zion's juniors. Just as one was about to be killed by the monster, Teacher Edward arrived in time, directing all students to take refuge on the 6th floor. He, along with Teacher Vakuna, who quickly arrived riding a dragon, rushed to the deeper floors. Teacher Vakuna, who had Kiki's location, had already found out they had fallen to the 11th floor. By this time, Liana and her team had been on the 11th floor for 16 hours. Their water and food supplies were running low, and constant monster attacks left them unable to relax. It was all up to Liana to keep going, and she was close to her limit. Liana felt responsible for her team's plight. If it hadn't been for her insistence on fighting the boss on the 10th floor, they wouldn't be in this situation. However, Colette argued that the monster was to blame, and that she had followed voluntarily. According to her, she wasn't dragged into this by Liana, but had brought it upon herself. Liana knew Colette was trying to comfort her, and Colette firmly believed that Will would find them. At that time, Ignore and his group sensed the presence of magicians. After turning a corner, they found Zion standing on the corpse of an evil spirit sentinel. Ignore was shocked. Had Zion defeated so many sentinels alone? Jurius then popped up, claiming he had helped too. Seeing that Zion and his team were safe, Will breathed a sigh of relief and immediately contacted his teammates to search for Liana and the others. Meanwhile, Colette heard footsteps and instinctively walked towards them, but Liana quickly pulled her back. A mage emerged, but his head fell off. This person, known as Headless, greeted them by writing with magic. His teammates joked that Headless was too playful, which allowed some monsters to reach the 11th floor, and suggested he should release the Duke to deal with the students. Colette questioned their identities, and someone claimed they were simply bad people aiming to destroy the false sky. Headless immediately tried to behead Liana and her group, but at the critical moment, Will intervened. Headless knocked Will away with a wave of his hand, but was then dragged away by his teammates who needed to retrieve something, prompting Headless to summon the Duke of Evil. Defeating the Duke of Evil earns a high score of 270 points. Upon his arrival, the Duke of Evil immediately displayed his powers. Will urgently warned everyone to flee, as staying would only result in taking hits. Ignore tried to use illusion magic for a cover-up, but the Duke of Evil tore through the illusion effortlessly. Fortunately, Will reacted quickly, grabbing Ignore and jumping to the side, escaping to a shelter. Will had read about the Duke of Evil in books. This special boss usually appears on the 25th floor and was likely transported here by a teleportation circle. Peering outside, Will spotted many evil spirit sentinels and monsters, apparently summoned by the Duke's command to search for them. It seemed the evil spirit sentinels were drawn here by the Duke. Jurius feared they might die here. Liana noticed her teammates were battered and nearly overwhelmed by despair. Yet Will volunteered to fight. With the escape route blocked by the Duke of Evil, their only option was to confront the battle head-on. Defeating this lead boss would cause the lesser monsters to collapse in disarray. Moreover, defeating the Duke of Evil would bring temporary peace to the chaotic dungeon, allowing the rescue teachers to reach them. Will's idea seemed far-fetched to Jurius, But Ignore and Colette supported it, and even Zion preferred a final attempt over a standoff with the evil sentinels. Ignore asked Liana to trust Will. Liana admired Will's courage, seeing him as the true leader of the group, and thus handed over the team leadership to him. Will resolved to lead everyone to safety. Crucially, the success of this plan depended largely on Jurius. As part of a deal, Will agreed to share the secrets of Elphalia's arcane techniques with Jurius, trusting his plans and judgment. Will then took on the task of distracting the Duke of Evil below, while Jurius chanted spells from above. Will informed Jurius that the secret technique of Elphalia involves a shortcut, where all duplicates can chant spells in segments. Even if a duplicate is destroyed, the next one can continue the chant, allowing the spell to be cast normally. Although simple in theory, it is difficult in practice. Fortunately, Jurius, a prodigy, was able to keep casting with the duplicates under the team's protection. Will targeted the Duke of Evil's wings as described in the books, aiming to immobilize him by blocking the wings. The wings were made of a material that was extremely hard and tough to penetrate. It took a great effort for Will to hook onto the wings. Luckily, by that time, Jurius had completed his chanting. Ice pillars froze the Duke of Evil's wings, though some attacks were still blocked. Will had a backup plan. He called on Liana, the strongest attacker, to strike during the moment the Duke of Evil's wings were immobilized. Unexpectedly, Headless and his group had preemptively fortified the Duke, thwarting Liana's attack. Will instantly teleported to protect Liana. At the same moment, the glasses Elphalia had given to Will were shattered, making the Duke of Evil's attacks even clearer. Edward, watching the situation through a video, realized the urgency and sped up his approach. Meanwhile, Will was stunned. Liana, having expended a lot of magical power, saw that the Duke of Evil had broken free from the ice. She told everyone to retreat with Will while she tried to delay the Duke. Coming from a family of guardian knights, it was her natural duty to protect her comrades. Ignore stepped forward, offering to help Liana in the battle. The two charged forward, but no matter how they attacked, they couldn't injure the Duke of Evil. At this moment, Zion's morale was crumbling, unsure whether to flee or stay and fight. He spoke of running away, yet his body refused to move. Unexpectedly, Will regained his composure and asked Zion to punch him, explaining that the goggles Elphalia had given him had cracked and he was too scared to move. Hearing this, Zion, furious, threw Will forward, exclaiming, "You led the counterattack. How can you be scared for such a reason?" After taking a couple of punches, Will calmed down. His body stopped trembling like before. He picked up a weapon from the ground and charged again. Zion remarked that Will did not seem afraid at all. Colette, however, said that Will had always been scared because they were magicians and could never understand the fear warriors face when charging forward with weapons. In fact, Will had always been timid, yet his courage to charge forward despite his fears was praiseworthy. Therefore, Colette decided to step forward and help. At that moment, Will was indeed scared of the Duke of Evil's attacks, but this fear was trivial compared to the fear of losing his teammates. He exchanged looks with Colette, who had come to help. Facing the Duke of Evil's attacks again, Will had memorized his magical trajectory. He discarded his weapon, and Colette had already constructed a new one for him in the front. Will rushed forward and sliced off one of the Duke of Evil's wings. Just then, Zion descended from the sky. He was particularly competitive, especially against Will, believing he could do anything Will could. As soon as he landed, he attacked the Duke of Evil, only to singe its fur, making everyone realize the terrifying nature of the monster they were facing. As Will gritted his teeth, pondering his next move, Rosti sneakily appeared above and dropped a block of ice towards him, reminding Will to remember the actions he had taken to protect the injured Elphalia. At that moment, Will recalled a woman in his memory who resembled his mother, and he remembered that the staff and sword needed to be merged. Therefore, he asked Zion to cast a spell towards him. Will boldly faced the flames, but his weapon absorbed the fire. His pupils turned crimson, and he instinctively muttered, "Charge complete." With his sword now blazing, he cleaved through the Duke of Evil. As the Duke of Evil was defeated, Will's physical strength also gave out. He was unaware of what had just happened, but everyone knew that the crisis posed by the Duke of Evil was over. Unexpectedly, with the loss of their leader, the evil spirit sentinels instantly went berserk. These sentinels swarmed in, overwhelming the few students present who had no ability to resist. They had already exhausted their magic fighting the Duke, especially Jurius, who was closest to the fray and nearly lost his life under the claws of the sentinels. Suddenly, the crisp sound of a staff touching the ground echoed. A golden light enveloped the malevolent sentinels below, instantly reducing them to dust. Vakuna and Edward abruptly stopped, and everyone looked up in surprise at the holder of the staff. The man was none other than Yalom, current leader of the Supreme Five Staffs and wielder of the Light Scepter, known as the strongest staff. All eyes were drawn to the Light Scepter, which commended the students' bravery, delighting everyone with the praise. Yet, Will's gaze couldn't leave the young man next to the Light Scepter. The youth approached Will, asked his name, and introduced himself as Finn, remarking that he hadn't expected the sword to still be alive. Meanwhile, the members of Headless retrieved a weapon, relieved that it hadn't fallen into the hands of the Supreme Five Staffs. The practical exam had resulted in the loss of 11 people, all of whom were teachers from the Magic Academy. The mastermind of the incident was being sought based on the testimonies of Will and others, but no leads were found. Will and his group were taken to a sanatorium. Colette was deeply saddened by the teacher's sacrifice, acknowledging that if the Light Scepter hadn't arrived in time, their fate could have been just as dire. Liana remarked, thankful they were all still alive. She felt particularly insightful for having assembled the team just to earn higher credits. After this battle, she confirmed they were a good team. As a new knight, she thanked everyone, only to have her stomach growl loudly. Colette immediately brought over sliced apples for her, not expecting Liana to be such a big eater. Liana nearly devoured a whole plate of apples, prompting Colette to shout that there would be none left for Will and the others. Liana argued that her magic and physical exertion were high, not because she was a big eater, but no one believed her. Colette sighed and continued peeling apples for Liana. Liana said that without Will's bravery and judgment, they might not have lasted until the Light Scepter arrived. Will credited everyone for their efforts. Jurius muttered nearby about the numerous tasks Will had assigned him, prompting Colette to silence him with an apple. Zion asked Will about the magic sword that absorbed his magic, a situation no one understood. Jurius began to complain again, questioning why Will hadn't used that power earlier, which had put everyone in danger. Kiki ran over and began scratching Jurius's face. Will admitted he was also unclear on why, having acted instinctively. They decided to consult their teacher about it. Liana noted the phenomenon was unusual. Triggered by the mention of unusual, Will curiously asked if anyone knew about the young man in the expedition team. Ignore thought for a moment and explained that the young man was an assistant, a descendant of the Light Clan. Although unable to use magic, the Light Clan had been gaining experience in the dungeons for generations, starting from the Witch Queen era. They had a contract with the tower to assist magicians in exploring deeper into the dungeons. Without the Light Clan's descendants, exploring deeper levels of the dungeons would be impossible. At this time, Finn, who was being discussed by Will and the others, had already met with the headmaster of the Magic Academy. He presented a weapon they had brought back from their dungeon expedition. This weapon, known as the Mage Killer, had been responsible for the deaths of 20 high-ranking magicians in the expedition team. Finn stated that such an item could not have naturally originated from the dungeon and suspected that someone was conducting experiments there. The investigation into the dungeon continued, while the dissection of the Mage Killer was handed over to the headmaster. However, Finn was more concerned about why the headmaster had not reported anything about Will to him. Logically, the staff was managed by the tower and the Magic Academy, while the sword should be under his control. The headmaster explained that Will greatly admired the staff and aimed to ascend the tower. It was unheard of for a sword to aspire towards a staff, but the headmaster saw it as an unexpected occurrence that could lead to change. They decided to let the headmaster manage Will for now, and Finn declared his intention to get involved in Will's education, which did not surprise the headmaster, as their goal was to defeat the celestial enemy. While everyone else was still recovering from injuries, Will had almost fully recovered, and even had the energy to practice sword fighting in the courtyard. He declared it was not the time to rest as he planned to continue his journey to be by Elphalia's side. Ignore and Liana admired Will's strength. Unexpectedly, Zion, having changed clothes, jumped down to challenge Will to a fight. However, he immediately clutched his stomach in pain upon landing. The ever-competitive Zion insisted that Will not ignore him and reminded him of their promise to fight again at the magical competition. Will decided to take up Zion's challenge, but their bout nearly injured Vakuna, a teacher passing by in the corridor. Startled by Vakuna's shout, they quickly fled. 2 months after the events involving the Duke of Evil, the Academy was preparing for the 6th-year final exams. This was Will's last chance to make his move towards the tower,